Colin Johnson and Joe Hunt.
Okay, so I'd like to talk about some work that we've been doing about association rule mining based on a database of folk music and looking at both the content and some of the metadata. And so basically I want to talk about how we can find musicologically relevant facts about a database of both content and meta features from this collection. So there have been one or two papers on this kind of thing over the years. And I suppose this idea of a very data-driven approach to looking at this kind of music goes back quite a long way. And there's an article from the 50s where someone takes this attitude, you know, what are the characteristic differentiae of different regions, of different, you know, are they rhythmical, modal, and so on. And so there's been some work on trying to do this using data mining techniques. But the work so far has primarily been what we might call predictive work. It's been very information retrieval driven. It's been driven by classification of geography or genre and so on. So people have tried to produce predictive models that allow you to take audio or MIDI or metadata and convert it into a prediction about genre or region or whatever. And there's been less work about what we might call descriptive rule mining, that is finding interesting, relevant facts about a database. And so we might say that this kind of, the kind of things that people talk about in folk music research have some of these characteristics. They're interested in over and under representation of feature values related to regions and genres and content. And we did an earlier paper, we did a paper in this Izmir symposium in October, which was about links between genre and region, and that was something we did there. And then we did something. Now we've extended this to look at content. So the basic idea here is this idea of association rule mining, which starts from notions of finding frequent item sets, as it's called. And the history of this goes back to what was called market basket analysis. This is the motivation that started this. So people started analysing commercial data and they wanted to find facts like this. If someone buys bread and cheese, then it's also highly likely that they'll buy butter. And that's deduced not from knowledge about bread and cheese and butter, it's deduced from a large collection of information collected on supermarket loyalty cards or whatever. So people have developed algorithms, and what we've done is have a variant on this a priori algorithm which builds up these so-called frequent item sets. And so it starts by finding the most common items, most common pairs that are based on, triples that are based on those pairs, and so on. And so in the end, what we're interested in is what we might think of as the musicological market basket. We want things that are commonly found together, features of melodies, both, as I said, in terms of content, in terms of location, in terms of genre, and so on. So one problem with this is that there are vast numbers of things that are true. There's far too much stuff is true. There's all this common knowledge. So if you try and do this kind of automated discovery, you find all these things that, as Molesworth put it, any fool know. You know, if you live in York, then you live in Yorkshire. You know, if you're pregnant, then you must be female. If you've got the name John, then you must be male. So all this stuff is largely uninteresting. And so people have started to look at notions of interestingness and saying, how can we extract interesting knowledge, or how can we filter this vast number of things that are generated to find things that are interesting? So there have been what are called objective interestingness measures, which have attempted to say, let's try and find rules that are in some way different from other rules. So, perhaps one kind of rule makes connections between two types of data that are not otherwise mentioned anywhere else in the collection of rules that have been generated. And there's also attempts to formalise common knowledge and say, well, what are they? What is common knowledge? And there's various attempts to do that, and that's complicated in a different way. So people have tried to formalise this notion of interestingness, whether that's just with regard to the rules themselves or with regard to an external body of knowledge. And what we were looking at is something to do with templates. So, what do we mean by templates? Well, in a lot of areas, there's a body of knowledge about some domains, but not others. So, for example, in what we're looking at, there's a body of writing about folk music, a body of musicological writing. So we collect those statements together, we read the articles, and then based on our knowledge of the domain and our knowledge of language, we try and group those together. So we form some groupings of those statements into a number of classes. And then we formalise these groups and we call them association constraints. So I'll say how this is done a bit later on. And then we use that formalisation to guide or filter the thing that comes out from the association rule mining. So there's been some previous work on this, mostly about what we might call content templates, saying what sorts of things that are interesting, but not so much about these kinds of this kind of thing which has both a rule template and what we'll call an evaluation measure. And again, I'll explain what that is in a minute. But what I'd like to do before I explain more of it is just to have a detour into talking about the source of the data that we've used for this case study. So there's this collection of Basque folk songs called the Cancionero Basco. I think I've pronounced that right. And this is collected in the early part of the 20th century, and various people worked on this. It was collected by this Padre Doblister in the early part of the 20th century, and there wasn't a definitive version of this until the 80s. There were various editing things that were done. And this consists of almost 2,000 songs and dances. They've all got notation, and quite a lot have got some annotation about genre and region. And these have been converted into a digital form in the last few years, and there's all this semantic web machinery that you've heard lots about already to formalise this. So we've got this idea of these are relatively simple, sort of genre ontology. You've got the idea of a hierarchical ontology of different song types. So people have grouped these songs into and annotated them with one or more of these genres. These are collected together. There's geographical information. So there are 7 provinces which break down into small number of municipalities and called hamlets, and there's a data collection of what's contained in what. I think the smallest level of granularity here is too small to be useful with regard to the data set, but the provinces are very useful. And finally, we've added most recently, this is the work we've just been doing this last few months, is to add content features to this. So there's about 20 or 30 content features that we've added. Some are taken from this work by Mackay and Fujinaga, who did this thing a few years ago, and we've added some additional ones. And so they're basically in 4 categories. There are things to do with the range and register of the tunes. There are simple things like that. There are things to do with the actual pitch content and scales and pitch classes and that kind of thing. So we've got things like the entropy of the pitch class distribution and so on. And then we've got things about interval content, melodic contour, directions and things like that. So here's an example of interval perplexity. Then we've got things to do with rhythm and so on. So, for example, the distinction between compound and simple meter. And what I annotated this with here is an example of a piece of a piece of text, and these are drawn from this Grove's Dictionary articles about folk music of various countries that illustrate that people are interested in these kinds of features. So this is the beginning of this formalisation. This is the beginning of the link to the literature in this. We've tried to associate these features with things that people talk about when they write about this sort of thing. And so, going further into that investigation of how people write about things, we've then tried to formalise the kind of things that we want to find out, which we've called categories, to overload a word that's already got far too many meanings. And what we did here was we took 25 articles from this dictionary, and then we followed that process that I talked about earlier, and formalised this in terms of a link between content and genre, either symmetrical or directional, sometimes to do with the complement of those, sometimes also including region in some of the work we've done. And then a rule evaluation measure, so a way of deciding when that association is strong enough to be regarded as interesting. We came up with 9 categories of things, which, let me do it the other way around. So they're the 9 categories. So is a content piece present in a genre? Is it absent? Is it found only in a genre? Is it always in that genre? Is it mainly? Is it dominantly? Is it typically? And so on. So these are the kinds of words that people use, the kind of concepts that people use when they're talking about this sort of thing. So we formalise that a little bit. And then we've got these rule association measures. So if you think about a link between, say, content and genre, a directional link, then we can count the number of instances that match both the content and the particular content feature and the particular genre feature we're interested in. And then we can define these different measures. So, support, how many times you find those things together, confidence, of all the examples of that, say, content, how many are in that pair, and then something that measures the size of that relative to the size of the individual things, and something that's to do with measuring the difference between presence and absence of it. So we've got various rule evaluation measures, and we associate one of those with with each of these categories. And so we get something like this, basically. We've got 9 of these. I'll just present a couple of examples for each. So here's an example, mainly. So here are some examples of the kind of text. This is stuff that humans have written about this kind of thing. This is stuff that presumably some people, because it's written about it, we infer from that this is the sort of thing that people find interesting about this. And so, 5-beat bars are mostly associated with wedding songs. Rhythmically free movements have mainly been recorded in the Salzkammergut area and things like that. And so the summary of all that collection of texts, is that some kind of content is overrepresented in that genre with respect to other genres. And we formalise that by saying there's a link from content to genre, and the way we're going to measure that is through this confidence measure, and so on. And so we can come up with these for all these different things. So we can say, pentatonic pitch patterns are rarely found in other genres, and so we can talk about things that aren't found. It's as interesting sometimes to know that something's absent or nearly absent as it is to know that it's present. And there's a measure that's particularly good at capturing that notion of absence. And so we use this at the moment basically as a filter. We apply this algorithm, and then we get a large number of association rules, and we use that to filter down that. There may be a more sophisticated way of doing that in the future. And then we use this, you can associate this with a statistical significance measure to get a p-value for each statement, which can be kind of enable us to choose which ones we consider to be important. So coming back to this, grayed out the original text and put an example on here. So coming back to mainly, we've got a pair here, which is a region name and this duration perplexity low, and then so there's 673 pairs that are common to those two features. Gives us a certain level of confidence, which associates a p-value with that, which is very low. So that's presumably one of the facts we want to report back as being interesting. And then we can convert that manually into natural language. So presumably we could almost automate that. Rhythmically conforming tunes have mainly been recorded in Navarre. And here's another example to do with the Hardley category. 56 children's songs, as over 1,000 things where the pitch class entropy is high. The pair count for that is very low. We make that measure of how low that is. Again, we convert that to a p-value. It's very, very low. It's so low. You can't see the number of significant figures. And so we can draw a conclusion from that. Again, we consider that to be the sort of thing that we ought to report as being interesting. Melodies with high pitch class entropy are hardly found in children's songs. So, what have we done here? Well, we looked back at the history of this and said that computational methods in folk music analysis have tended to focus on predictive classification. They've tended to focus on this information retrieval type attitude, which is very valuable for some applications. But for finding out interesting descriptive material, those predictive models are not so powerful. They can be very complex. They can have a lot of stuff in them that is not very readable by humans. So we're interested in capturing interesting knowledge from that information. So what do we mean by interesting? Well, we mean it fits into one of these categories, the sort of thing that people write about. And so we've had this idea of categories that contain one of these templates and an evaluation measure, and that's a way of formalising what we mean by musicologically interesting knowledge. And so the idea is that, and I think the examples show this, that the kind of statements found by the system are of a similar structure to those which are written about by people who do research into this kind of area. And so we think that there's this idea of these combinations of templates and rule evaluation measures have a nice fit with a lot of the methodologies that we find in these kind of digital humanities type problems. So that's that. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So we have time for one or two questions before we go to the coffee break.
Did I notice correctly that in your beginning of your presentation, you did not include the Basques of France? And I wonder, was that just the way the stuff came together?
Can I defer to my colleague back there? Do you know about this?
French region is
Yes.
Is it?
Right. Okay.
Does this categorical approach mean that the history and geography of folk music kind of same structure?
So the history.
The structure of folk music kind of comes out as being its history, geography, genealogy.
I think.
Can you find more sort of interesting second order features in that?
What would, such as what? What would you mean by second order features?
Tracing and development of some musical device or something.
I think you could if you had the information that was structured over time. This data set at the moment is very much a snapshot of a particular point in time. It's something that was collected over 10, 20 years or so in the early 20th century, and there's not so much annotation about time, but there are collections. I mean, I don't know there are collections of melodies over time, and I've certainly seen other books of English folk melodies that sort of have been collected over 40 or 50 years that have that idea of time in. You could presumably use. I think there are. I don't know much about it, but I think there are some ideas of finding those sort of patterns. Yes. So if you have the data, you could find it. I mean, what's nice about this is a very well curated, very well annotated piece of data, and so if you had that data, you could have. But that's in a sense the rate limiting step is the availability of the data.
I think since we're at the coffee break now, I might as well defer further questions and discussion to that. So thanks to the speaker again. Remember that the posters are still on display, so if you haven't seen them, or even if you have, go upstairs from where the coffee is served and check them out.